Thanks, Jane. So thank you and welcome, and thank you for coming, because I think this is a fantastic initiative that NDS has put together. What I was asked to talk about in 10 minutes is where are we at and why is it important? And I thought the best way of doing this was through the lens of the communique which came out of the National Roundtable and tried to deliver a positive message forward away, a kind of a direction that people could agree with, and then we could add bits too. It certainly was a good day, and there was some amazing heavy hitters in the room at the time. And it's hard, and I think we've got to be aware that it's hard to drive this agenda forward over time. It often falters, so it's really important that we maintain some of that momentum. I did some. There's variations in the numbers, but I think the numbers you read are absolutely fine. It is very important because it is very common, much more common than you would imagine, really. And arguably, up to half of people with intellectual disability have a mental disorder, and that's a lot of people, and potentially up to 1%, over 1% of the population, which is equivalent to the prevalence of schizophrenia when you think about it. That's a lot. And when you think of the amount of resources going appropriately to addressing issues around schizophrenia, there would be a fraction goes into mental health problems for people with intellectual disability. The comparisons are stark. In fact, the National Health and Hospital Reform Commission report said the health disadvantage is actually stark. They were the words they used, and they extracted them from a document that Jim and I put together, so we were very pleased they used our words. Anyway, so it has a profound effect on people's life. There's no doubt about this. That people's lives are destroyed, and Kathy will give you some examples of that. Why this occurred, I think some of it emerged during the process of deinstitutionalisation, whereas people would say the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and the medical model, or the custodial model care, was very correctly in lots of regards rejected. But what we got is a neglect of health and health issues substantially across the board. And this is the label jars, not people, are a symbol of that period. So next slide. So looking at this, I looked at these and thought about this. My background is that I'm originally a GP. I did a couple of years training in psychiatry, but also I did 6 months delivering babies. So I've done a variety of things over time, and have worked in this area for 22 years. And I take the point, this is kind of almost like a greenfield site. The opportunity to produce change is massive, but that's partly because the situation is so bad. And it's particularly bad as I had the fantastic opportunity to spend 4 months, 5 months in the UK, where they have a really big focus on this area. And the difference between the two countries is extraordinary. The UK actually really thinks about this population at every level and delivers services very high quality. Of course, not always high quality, but high quality services generally. And they come to Australia, and UK practitioners like Greg O'Brien wander around kind of saying, well, where is this and where is that? And it's like a barren site in terms of services in Australia when they compare the two. Okay, so the needs of people with intellectual disability and mental health are specifically considered and accommodated to all mental health initiatives. Now, this is not readily apparent, and the National Roundtable came out of the first National Commission report that actually didn't even mention intellectual disability, or it didn't come out of that, but we were prompted further by this frequent occurrence that I've had over the last 22 years where this population isn't even mentioned, or maybe tacked on to a report. There was, if you remember, in the 90s, there was Brian Vertigan did a report, a Royal Commission, and they tacked on a bit, which a couple of bits about the disparity of this population then, and kind of there was a cry to do something. There is precedence in other areas of disadvantage to drive change, and I think we should realise that we can actually make change. We can put resources in if we can document the problem and then direct resources to it and do things. And I guess that's part of the reason I wore this tie. We're doing some fantastic things in Aboriginal health. We're doing some fantastic things in the non-English speaking background population. And these things produce real change. For some reason, this doesn't happen as much in people with intellectual disability. People with intellectual disabilities and their families receive education and support to prevent mental disorders, to obtain early and timely assistance for mental disorders. Unfortunately, our experience, and Kathy will talk about this more, is that people present late, and even when they present late, they often are restricted and don't get access to service. I won't talk about that because Kathy can talk about that at greater length than I. There is also true that there is massive limitations in expertise and knowledge in this area, not just within mental health services, but also in disability services and also in the community generally. Some of the things that we've done over time, we've run family days to try to support families in this regard. We and Luke is here, who runs Luke Hatzapetro runs a private psychiatric service or mental health service for people with disability. So there's little islands of expertise out there. To be frank, Queensland's not too bad compared to the rest of Australia. But to be frank, Australia's dreadful. So, you know, there is stuff here in terms of clinical services delivery. Okay, element 3, all mental health services provide equitable access and appropriate skilled treatment to people with intellectual disabilities. Now, you know, it is very limited in private and public. I've made that point. We have had the emergence of mental health facilitators in Queensland, and they've, in my anecdotal experience, have done a great job of trying to link in where they can and help mental health service deliver services. And that's been a really interesting and exciting initiative, I think, that's happened. It's been somewhat reduced in size more recently, I think cut in half, but that's, I think, one of the things that people have played with, an approach that seems to have promise. We do education, Kathy and I, but mainly Kathy does education of, increasingly Kathy does education of psychiatric registrars, both in their third year and in their paediatric training. And Kathy, who will tell you, she presents also, and I'll describe, at national conferences and runs a special interest group, but that more about later. During the heady days of about 10 years ago, we got some funding from mental health and developed a dual diagnosis, or dual disability it really should be called, training kit, which is a train the trainers type kit that was used widely through Queensland. And so there was things that were set in place. The roll on from that, the continuation, the reiteration, the development of that process hasn't occurred. It's stalled over time. Just roll on to the next one. Element 4, the National Network of Specialists in Intellectual Disability Mental Health is available to support mainstream mental health services by provision of consultancy training through research. Kathy will talk about the special interest group of the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, which she drives in Queensland and has presented at their various congresses in Australia more recently. That has absolutely increased, and it's one of the very exciting new things on the block over the last 5 years that has driven change. I've mentioned training of psychiatrists. There is research in Australia in this area. Actually, there's some very good research, because Professor Bruce Tong and Stuart Einfeld have run a long longitudinal study over many years looking at children and adolescents who are now adults, where some of these statistics actually are completely drawn from to give the ideas of prevalence and the details about the psychopathology. But it's purely chance that we had two now senior esteemed researchers in the area that have actually pushed in this particular direction when they could have gone in many others. There's no systematic way that this has been embedded in our research culture to think of this population. The National Mental Health Survey actually excludes this population. I mean, that's enormously extraordinary when you think about it. They tried to get up a core question to try to grab the population then, because we tried to deliver it for them, and then they didn't include it. That's an amazing fact. Would this happen to any other disadvantaged group that you're talking about, 1 to 2, 3% of the population? No. Anyway, so there is research, and but there's no systematic way where we're actually trying to tease out some of the details of not only the prevalence, but also what's effective in interventions. And roll forward. Element 5, ongoing joint planning by disability services, schools, mental health and other relevance, including identification of referral pathways, a framework and capacity for collaborative responses where intellectual disability and mental health coexist. Indeed, in the mid-2000s there was actually a framework developed between disability services. I think you were involved in it, Luke, and other people were involved in it. And there was sites where there was active collaboration occurred. In Cairns was one particular place. Toowoomba, there was a group that actually disability support staff and mental health staff actually sat together around a common table and worked out the difficult clients. And some of that was very exciting. It's now dropped off, actually. And I'm not aware that that framework is still operative, but I actually don't live in disability services, and people might be able to tell me that I've missed this completely. But there was definitely a framework. And some various positive models developed. I think of the community living program on this side of the river, which has got an interesting model looking for, I think, for people with mild, with intellectual disability and a mental disorder, and trying to work best with them in a community setting, and other various positive models that are out there that are just little fragments of change that are positive. I've mentioned the mental health facilitators. Element 6, training in intellectual disability and mental health to a minimum standard of frontline and other professional staff in disability services, schools and health services, particularly in the primary health and mental health services. Well, there's been, again, patches of areas. Some of the things that I think of highlights, and other people may have other highlights, that is that recently through Miriam Taylor, who was here before, but she seems to have disappeared, we developed a training kit for GPs on intellectual disability that's available nationally. It's on intellectual disability broadly, but it includes mental health, of course. And we also, in the primary care, in the curriculum for GP trainees, intellectual disabilities is part of their curriculum, it's embedded in it. For years we've developed a handbook on health and intellectual disability across Australia that's accessible and well known in the health area. And I mentioned our mental health training kit as some of the educational things. And we have a lovely website which I just show you. I highly recommend it to you with lovely videos. And data, I mentioned that we're not collecting data in Australia, that these people are passively and actively excluded from many studies. And I tried when Bill Shorten was national, the Secretary for Disability, I pointed out that in NHMRC applications, I have to tick a box whether I'm including Indigenous people. Why isn't there a box there saying, don't I including intellectually disabled people? And then he wove it into a speech, but I've not ever mentioned it since. But it's really a good question. Why are you excluding this population? And have you actually even thought about it? They're excluding it because it's difficult and it's time consuming and expensive. But we should be saying, well, that's not right. This population have a right to be included. And if you're going to produce this literature that says this research is good for everybody, you've got to prove it's good for everybody. And there's various bits and pieces that are done over time. But it is, we're arguing the case nationally, but it's not embedded. Just the last one. Multiple disadvantage is a particular concern. And I think of, we're involved in a large randomised control of all prisoners as they left prison, and we were able to analyse this data and find that about 9% of people with intellectual disability or borderline intellectual disability had greater. The prison population as a whole have awful health, physical and mental health. Believe me, you look at the numbers and it's kind of you pale, it's that bad. But in fact, the intellectual disability population within that have even worse health. And that's what we've been able to demonstrate. And if you're talking about, up to 1 in 10 prisoners in this situation, that's incredible vulnerability. But there is some research that are identifying this, and there has been various people interested. So there is much to do. I mean, I think that's both a little bit depressing, but I also think that it actually provides enormous opportunities for you to now reflect where you come from and what things that you can possibly, maybe it's just twitching it a bit forward. Maybe it's that one agenda item saying, I will do this, and let's see what we get. This is not going to be a rapid change. It may be, but it's not going to be rapid. So I think have a think about it and catch the wave and make the difference. And that's all I've got. This final slide. I've got a little thought from Lisa Bridle introduced me to this. It's a funny thing about life. If you refuse to accept anything but the best, you often get it. Thank you.